This video is sponsored by NordVPN. As with many game franchises, the Legend of Zelda series is filled with side quests. Side quests which either fall into one of two categories: really good or really bad. It's said that there are 3 guarantees in life: death, taxes, and video games with awful side quests. Most of the time, these revolve around mundane tasks such as collecting X amount of materials or killing a number of enemies. And Breath of the Wild is no exception to this rule. While ones such as building Tarrytown from the ground up do stick out, many others are rather lackluster. Something which will hopefully be fixed in the upcoming Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. But what happens when you have a side quest that's remembered by players, and all for the wrong reasons? A quest which stuck out not because it was fun or immersive, but due to much more uncomfortable reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's video we'll be talking about how a mistranslation ruined this Breath of the Wild side quest. Following the completion of Divine Beast Vah Ruta, Link can backtrack to the Bank of Wishes where he'll come across a Zora child named Finley. According to Finley, she's been communicating with a mysterious stranger via bottled messages. Link then agrees to follow her letter downstream, in which it's revealed that the person she's conversing with is a Hylian man named Sasan. The two meet up in Zora's domain, and Link is given a gold rupee for his troubles. So, why exactly is this quest so infamous among the Zelda community? Someone who's never played Breath of the Wild may first think it comes from the fact that this quest is essentially an escort mission, a gameplay mechanic that most people hate doing. And yeah, it is a rather tedious side quest, but in terms of escort missions, it's not that difficult. The real reason lies within the narrative itself and the relationship between Finley and Sasan. Both parties refer to the message in a bottle as a love letter, and further dialogue tells us that this is most definitely a romantic sort of love. And if this hasn't already raised some red flags, by the end of the side quest, Finley thanks the player for introducing her to her soulmate, and Sasan refers to Finley as his darling. Naturally, this caused quite a stir within the community, since the whole goal of this quest is bringing together a Zora child and Hylian adult male in a romantic relationship. And the fact that a side quest this uncomfortable and creepy is in the Zelda series, of all things, is rather shocking. It's almost as if there was some sort of error in the midst of development which led to this outcome. At its core, this error lies with mistranslations. So in order to figure out what went wrong here, we're going to have to look at the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild. This is where I want to give a quick shout out to QuestWithAaron, who not only helped with translating this text, but also agreed to join me on this endeavor.
When we think about the production process of video games, the first things that come to mind are things such as graphics, story, overall gameplay, or music. But there's many more layers of game development. One of those being localization, the process of preparing a video game for a market outside of where it was originally published. And a big part of this is translating a game so that people outside of that initial market understand what's happening. But this creates a huge issue, as while a game may be fully translated, there's the possibility of its narrative being altered due to poor translations. Breath of the Wild itself includes a number of differences when compared to the Japanese version, 2 well-known examples being the quest log, which in the original was structured more as a diary, giving Link some personality, and then there's this quote said by Zelda at the end of the game, where she states that Ganon had given up on reincarnation when in reality it was the exact opposite. So in order to get a much clearer picture on this matter, our first priority is compiling all of the Japanese text of this side quest. That's the easy part. The hard part is having to translate this to see whether the context is changed in the localization. And well, there's a lot of dialogue to go over, so much that if we were to get translations of everything, it would take forever. So for now, let's stick to the bits of the localized version that directly reference love, and compare those to what's present in the Japanese version. Both Sasan and Finley refer to the message in a bottle as a love letter. However, this phrasing is only used in the English version. Instead, the Japanese text quite literally translates to message bottle. This wording is consistent throughout the entire quest, whether it be the dialogue of Sasson or Finley. This is a significant change in the overall narrative of this questline, since there's a huge difference between a message bottle and a love letter. Even if we were to argue that different types of love exist, love letters have always been associated with the romantic kind, not to mention the fact that this isn't the only bit of text referencing a non-platonic relationship.
Sasson states that in his exchanges with Finley, he lied about being a buff traveler, and that following this, she wanted to meet up with him. He goes on to say that he regrets lying to her in his messages, that if he had known this would happen, that he'd fall for her, he never would have lied, which further pushes the narrative that Sasson is in love with Finley. However, this part about him falling for her is not present whatsoever in the Japanese version. Instead, Sasson simply expresses guilt for lying to her. It's the equivalent to lying to an online friend to impress them, only for it to backfire when they want to meet in real life. In this same conversation, one of Link's responses is "Love reigns supreme," seemingly encouraging Sasson to meet up with Finley. Again, if we look at the Japanese version, this bit translates to something along the lines of, "It's important to have a heart." It's very close to the phrase "to have heart," usually meaning to never lose heart, faith, strength, or anything related to those. So Link is simply telling Sasson that he shouldn't let this mistake get to him. The issue isn't the fact that he's meeting up with Finley, it was the romantic implications it had. Remove that, and this whole relationship seems much more platonic. Judging from the dialogue, neither knows much about each other. In fact, both seem to make assumptions on the other's age based on their writing. Another line taken from the localization comes from Finley. If the player lies about being a servant of the Water Fairy, she tells Link not to make fun of her just because she's a cute girl. This phrasing has a rather flirtatious tone to it, in contrast to the Japanese version, where instead she says, "Please don't tease me just because I'm a child." It's a subtle change, but one that makes a huge difference overall.
With that said, it's not as if all references to love are non-existent in the Japanese version. Near the end of the quest, Finley thanks Link for his troubles and for introducing her to her soulmate. While this term isn't exclusively related to romantic relationships, most of the time when it is brought up, that is the implication. Combine that with everything else we've discussed, and it makes this conclusion all the more likely. However, in the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild, Finley instead refers to Sasson as her person of destiny, and while this too can be interpreted as a soulmate, it can quite literally mean a person you are destined to meet. And when you take a step back and look at the events which led to this encounter, it makes a whole lot of sense. Recall that both Finley and Sasson were already communicating via bottled messages, so one could argue that from Finley's perspective, they were destined to meet. Now that's the first example. The second reference to love is much more direct. Breath of the Wild's text dump includes this bit of dialogue, which we can assume is said by Finley, as it mentions having to rewrite a letter. In the second half of the dialogue, she says, "After all, they say the more you have to struggle for love, the sweeter it is." Translating the Japanese text gives us two different results. The first is, a person with a little trial can make love also burst into flames, which is a bit of an awkward sentence. But the second translation sounds much more plausible. A little challenge can make love burn even brighter. You could argue that the love referenced here isn't romantic. However, this context does sort of hint at it being that kind of relationship. But considering that a significant amount of these references to love were added into the localization, perhaps the love felt by Finley is meant to be the innocent kind, like when a kid says they want to marry their teacher. Finley may be older than Sasson, but in Zora years, she's still a child. At the very least, it's clear that love isn't mentioned nearly as much in the original.
Something I found rather interesting about these two bits of dialogue was that both of them come from Finley herself. So the only times the Japanese version ever references love are from the perspective of her. All of the bits which originated from Sasson are no longer present. And trust me, there is more regarding him that we haven't yet gone into. It further suggests that these feelings are simply revealing Finley's innocence as a child. But this is where things escalate from a mere error to what was the localization team thinking. And believe me when I say that I use the term error very loosely. Before we get to that though, I want to take this time to talk about today's sponsor, NordVPN. Because, let's face it, sending personal information via bottled messages down the river isn't exactly the safest form of communication. Whenever you connect to a public network, you're at risk of having private information stolen. Think about it this way. Connecting to a public network is sort of like throwing a bottled message into this river. Anyone who has access to this stream of information can see whatever you're inputting, such as passwords and bank info. Luckily, NordVPN currently has a deal where purchasing a 2-year plan gives you 4 additional months. All you have to do is go to the link in the description, nordvpn.com/NintendoBC. VPNs are incredibly useful because they allow you to encrypt any sort of internet traffic and hide your IP address. It also lets you bypass any region-locked content. All it takes is a single click to connect to one of many servers from 59 different countries. So make sure to check out the link in the description, nordvpn.com/NintendoBC. That's nordvpn.com/NINTENDOBC. And now, back to today's video. As of now, most of the stuff talked about could be written off as merely mistranslations, the only exception to this being the addition of bits such as how Sasan fell for Finley. But, here's the thing. That's only the tip of the iceberg. There's more, quote-unquote, additions which make this whole situation even worse. Not only are there extra bits of text inserted into already existing quotes, but there's some dialogue that straight up doesn't have a Japanese equivalent. We're talking about entire sentences that were added into what was already there. Let's start with this line taken from Sasan's dialogue that's directed towards Finley. He calls her his darling, obviously meant to portray feelings of romance. But all Sasan says in the Japanese version is, "Yeah, I'll do my best." However, there are 2 instances where additional bits of text were added in. The first part being where Sasan notes that, as Azora, Finley's a lot older than him. Something similar is said by Finley herself, who ends the conversation with, "Love requires an open mind, wouldn't you say?" Knowing this, the overall question shifts from, why was there an error in mistranslations, to, can this really be considered an error? Notice how the only 2 cases where text was added in are ones talking about Finley's age, how as Azora she's clearly older than Sasan. This is because the Zora have significantly longer lifespans than other races in the Zelda series such as Gorons, Ritos, and Hylians. In fact, they are of the few who remember Link and what happened during the Great Calamity. But this also makes the motive behind adding this dialogue rather obvious. It's an attempt to justify the romantic relationship between Finley and Sasan. The term age of consent is often thrown around when it comes to this sort of thing. Another is the word minor, a person under the age of full legal responsibility. The reason this is so important is because it's related to the primary argument used to defend this sort of pairing, since technically Finley's older than Sasan. The biggest issue with this is that it's assuming both parties have the same age of consent, which in normal circumstances would only slightly differ based on where you live. But we're talking about a game with numerous races and/or species. If the Zora have much longer lifespans, naturally it's safe to assume that it takes longer for one to become an adult. So it's not necessarily about the age, it's about whether or not that individual is classified as an adult. You can't use Hylian years to accurately guess a Zora's age group, and the reverse is also true. But let's take a look at another Hylian-Zora relationship that, while not canon, does play a significant part in the game's story: the relationship between Link and Mipha. If the pairing of Sasan and Finley is so controversial, can't the same be said for this relationship? Well, a big difference between both examples is the timing of things. According to Mipha's diary, her first encounter with Link was at Zora's domain when he was around 4 years old. However, it isn't until page 5 of her journal entries that she begins to develop feelings for him, after he quickly disposed of a Lionel terrorizing the villagers. While we're not given an exact timing of when this happens, there are 2 cases of Mipha referencing a fairly long time skip. The entry right after page 5 mentions that Mipha had been chosen to pilot Vah-Ruta, later mentioning that she had finished gathering materials for the armor she planned to present to Link as a sort of marriage proposal. The reason this hasn't sparked any controversy lies with the fact that, regardless of their age, Mipha fell in love with Link when both are presumably adults, or at the very least, much closer in comparison to the duo of Sasan and Finley, since technically we don't know the age of Link. All this to say that there's something rather fishy going on in the localization team. Pun intended. It's clear that the people responsible for the translations knew how weird the situation was, since they added in additional dialogue to try and quote-unquote justify this relationship. But you wouldn't need to, since most of the lines referencing romance are bits that were, for some odd reason, translated poorly. It all just seems like too much of a coincidence for this to be accidental, and feels more like it was intentional. The only way I could see this being an error is if the team responsible for the localization of Breath of the Wild took the couple cases of love in the Japanese version as romantic. But again, there was an awful lot added in, suggesting that they wanted it to happen.
However, Sasson and Finley aren't the only two characters we can get information from. Talking to Finley's mother following the completion of Divine Beast Vah Ruta gives us some additional dialogue, and unlike our past translations, the English version is nearly identical to the Japanese text. The first takes place during or before the special delivery side quest, where Coda states that Finley was searching for a prince of her very own. Once Sasson arrives at Zora's domain, she views him as an unreliable man, commenting on Finley's horrible taste in men. In the Japanese version, it instead translates to her claiming Finley to have a non-existent sense, which is probably meant to be the same thing, but was changed in the localization for English speakers. First off, this is yet another bit of dialogue which references a romantic sort of love, but from the perspective of Finley. While Coda is the one speaking here, she's merely repeating what Finley herself said in regards to finding a prince of her own, and it gives us a reasonable explanation for why she set out on this quest in the first place. It's likely that her line about finding a prince of her own is referencing Prince Sidon, who we know was popular with both the adults and the children, so it's probably just meant to be an innocent kind of love rather than anything romantic. Aside from that, there are more minor differences between the localization and Japanese version, but nothing too incriminating. Phrases such as "a lovely Zora" and "caught my eye" aren't present in Sasson's dialogue. He does describe the sender of the message bottles as a young lady, but explicitly says "elegant adult woman" in the Japanese text. But young doesn't always mean child. In fact, this further suggests that Sasson had minimal knowledge on who he was talking to, also explaining why in the original version, all of the romance mentioned comes from Finley herself. Some differences of the dialogue of Finley are worth mentioning. For example, she never says that she's desperately wanting to meet Sasson. One of the more major changes, though, comes from the part where she describes what Sasson wrote in his letters, stating that he was a buff and gorgeous traveler, but there's no mention of the gorgeous bit in the Japanese copy.
So, now that we have a much clearer picture as to what's supposed to be said in the dialogue, how was this quest really played out? Well, let's first talk about Finley's motives. We've already gone over one possibility of it all being due to some sort of admiration of Prince Sidon, but there's another equally likely motive brought up by Finley in the story. According to her, there's a superstition that if you send a love letter from the Bank of Wishes and get a response, you'll have good fortune for life. The Japanese version is fairly similar, stating that there is a tradition among girls where sending a message bottle from this riverside of wishes and getting a reply means you'll become happy. So one could argue that this too is a reason why Finley started sending letters down the river. But what about the relationship side of things? At this point, it seems pretty clear that this quest was originally meant to be a platonic relationship between two individuals. Neither seem to know much about the other, and all references to a romantic-based love are solely from Finley's perspective, meant to show her innocence as a child. Not to say that this sort of questline couldn't work out without romance. For example, they could have had Sasson fall in love with the person he was talking to, believing them to be an adult woman, but once he finds out it's a child, they end up being friends. In the past, people have asked me why I always insist on using Japanese translations for theories and/or other content, and I hope that this video helped explain why proper translations are so important. Context can easily be altered or lost altogether if the translation is poor. Either way, I hope this makes people at least feel a bit less uncomfortable when playing this side quest, since you now have the knowledge of how it was intended to play out. That's going to be all for this video. Thank you for watching, and a huge shout out to QuestWithAaron, who not only joined me on this video, but also did all of the translations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild says, I highly recommend checking out his other content, as this is sort of his forte. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.